Now we have a guy who tried to do a coup in the imperial freaking homeland. And they're still doing it, trying to overthrow previously normative bourgeois democracy and constitutional rule of law.
There's no casual discussions of fascism. It's either a threat, and then it's an existential threat, or it isn't.
This is fascism. And if you don't stop it, it's going to dig in, and it's going to be here for a very long goddamn time.
The alternative of inaction is even more dangerous, because then you allow people to do things like engage in an insurrection and try and steal an election. And next time, maybe it doesn't end so well for you.
We're going to need more than voting. We're going to need movements. We're going to need people power. We're going to need people in the streets.
Welcome to episode 128 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. Thanks to everyone who goes the extra step and rates and reviews on Apple Podcasts, shares and comments on social media or YouTube. It helps us reach more listeners. And of course, we read everyone. Here is an email I received from this past week. Hi, Sam. I'm telling friends to listen to this podcast for essential updates on the abortion rights situation. I also watch the news media, of course, but it is a hodgepodge to sift through, and I don't get the overall picture and summary of the key issues. This podcast is useful for that. Thank you. FYI, I don't have an Apple iPhone or computer, so apparently I can't listen on Apple Podcasts and rate, comment, review, but I can still listen on Spotify or Google Podcasts, although they apparently don't give options for rating, comment, etc. And people can also listen on YouTube and like, comment, share them there. Zeke. Well, thank you, Zeke, for your kind words and very importantly, sharing the show and letting folks know how else they can listen and promote. I did want to let you know that on Spotify, listeners can leave ratings, but no reviews yet. To leave a rating, you're going to go to our show. You're going to make sure that you follow it if you have not done so already. Click that follow button. Then you're going to tap on the star button, follow the instructions to rate the show. If you have not listened to the show on Spotify before, they're going to prompt you to listen to a few episodes before you rate and review. So yeah, you can do that. You can rate us there, and that would be awesome. So after listening to today's episode, go help us find more people who want to refuse fascism by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or rate review on another platform, and encourage your friends and family who listen to do the same. Subscribe, follow, so you never miss an episode. Subscribe to our YouTube as well. And of course, continue all that sharing and commenting on social media, that commenting on YouTube. It is the best. Before the interview, we want to salute all the women and all the people rising up in Iran for Mahsa Amini and an end to theocracy. Mahsa, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman in Iran, was beaten to death by morality police after being arrested for an improper headscarf in Tehran last week. The fury of women flooding the streets of Iran, cutting their hair, refusing to wear headscarves in the face of violent repression from the state, burning their hijabs in defiance of these morality police have inspired protests across Iran. It has increased the courage and determination of others across the country. It is a powerful display of the refusal to accept tradition's chains one moment longer. The refusal to be beaten, abused, controlled by the states for being a woman is an inspiration to people all over Iran and people all over the world. As feminist author Mona Eltahawy wrote earlier this week in her powerful essay, quote, "Glory and power to the women in Iran for serving us this challenge. If women and men in one of the most perfect police states are this unscared, then what are you doing to fight your oppressors?" End quote. She goes on in her essay to write, quote, "As you see it, as you watch the glory and power of the feminist revolution in Iran right now, Ask yourself. I'm looking at you people in the US cheering on the feminist revolution against theocrats over there. What the fuck you are doing to fight theocrats and fascists over here, and make sure it's more than hashtags and just voting, end quote. We must all take note, take heart, and take to the streets. Look at how they are finding their power in their actions, their power in each other. Take note, but more essentially, follow them into the streets. With that, here's this week's interview. So here we are, 20 months post-coup attempt, and Trump not only still roams free, he continues to lead a Republican Fascist Party, free to hold Nazi rallies, a party which I need to say is completely consolidated around fascism, the big lie, a party which wherever they hold power has trampled on the rights and lives of oppressed people, banning abortion, criminalizing dissent, outlawing, teaching real history, suppressing vote, and raining a particular hell on trans youth, just for some of what has been at play. So it's essential to talk with folks who have been sounding the alarm and writing in depth on how this fascism can, has, and is happening here. So today we're doing something a bit different on the show, and I am all here for it. I'm talking with Anthony DiMaggio and Paul Street. Anthony is a professor of political science at Lehigh University. His latest book, Rising Fascism in America, It Can Happen Here, is linked to in the show notes. And Paul is an author, journalist, political commentator, historian. His most recent book is This Happened Here, Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America. It's also linked in the show notes. And Paul is on the editorial board of Refuse Fascism. They are both, I need to mention, in various states of recovery. So I'm extra grateful that they're talking with us today. One is healing from surgery and the other from, I think, a virus, maybe the flu, hopefully not. So they're both medicated and this should be fun. So I am so glad to welcome them both back on the show. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're both stoned off our ass. So looking forward to talking.
Let's start with what has been really on my mind, and I know that both of you have been researching and writing about it in various ways. After, winking and nodding at QAnon for years, Trump is, without a doubt, overtly embracing really the lunatic, baseless conspiracy theory known as QAnon. And this is at a time where extremely ominous real-world events that are acts of terror carried out by those affiliated with QAnon are growing and spreading. Earlier this week, Trump went all in on Q, leaving the winking aside, sharing QAnon content on Truth Social. In particular, this Punisher imagery, memes promising military tribunals, executions, the latest iteration of Trump openly committing to murdering his political opponents. And this is on top of his latest rally where the QAnon music played. They did the Q version of Sig Heil. And, I think Trump even was up to now wearing like a Q lapel pin. Anyway, what the hell is going on here? Tony, I know that you wrote recently about this. Do you want to take a stab at it first?
Sure. So if you've been paying close attention to this for the last couple of years, everybody knows that Trump is a QAnoner, but he's always had what he thought was plausible deniability, not very plausible. I mean, because you can't talk about how QAnon loves America, fights pedophilia, be inviting numerous QAnoners to the White House like Sidney Powell and Michael Flynn to try and overthrow an election, hiring Mike Lindell, another QAnoner, to be in your campaign and plausibly say that you're not in QAnon. So, he's just sort of removed any sort of even basic attempt at plausible deniability when he's posting these things himself. If you were looking over the last few years, there's actually been some decent research on this. Apparently he's retweeted or reposted on his new social media account between both more than 150 times. QAnon accounts, perspectives, content. This was black comedy a long, long time ago. I mean, you don't accidentally repost QAnon content more than 150 times. And so then, of course, the final coming out sort of party is him posting the content that shows him with the "where we go one, we go all" motto. The storm is coming. And these are just sort of like infamous QAnon slogans. unless you're just like willfully ignorant with your head buried in the sand, you really can't deny anymore that this is going on. And then I think it's really just a question of understanding what that means. I think that unfortunately, if you look at the political commentary on this, and this is something I try to talk about in my recent Counterpunch piece on this, erasing QAnon fascism. This is a neo-fascist movement. It's not neo-fascistic. I use that term in my book. I don't think it's really accurate anymore because there's this idea that Donald Trump, for a long time, he relied on fascist themes while not claiming fascism. So hence the ick part, neo-fascistic. This is just neo-fascist. If you look at QAnon that he's identifying with, they recycle old Nazi-era blood libel propaganda that framed the Jews as drinking the blood of children and as satanic. If you look at the actual polls on this recently, there was a Morning Consult poll, found out that half of QAnon supporters say that liberalism, quote, equipped Jews to destroy institutions and gain control of the world. And this is old sort of anti-Semitic propaganda talking about how the Jews control the economy, the media, politics. Apparently, people in the survey who said they believed in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is old Russian anti-Semitic propaganda from more than 100 years ago, right? 80% of these people who buy into that anti-Semitic propaganda also believe in QAnon. So there's clearly the anti-Semitism here. There's clearly the cult of Trump behind QAnon. When you talk about this idea that he is going to impose himself as a dictator, and it never happens, but then it gets reprophesized over and over and over, like the second coming of Jesus or something, right? This guy is a deity type figure for them. You've got the anti-liberal democracy angle. Clearly, you're anti-liberal democracy, liberal in the small L sense, not like liberal Democrats, but the whole idea of electoralism and democracy. If you are against elections and want them overthrown. And of course, they're eliminationists too. They want the Democrats strung up on streetlights, hung, executed in public. Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Barack Obama. All four of these elements are classic fascism. They're not neo-fascistic, they're just fascist.
Paul, did you want to chime in?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I want to reinforce this point that this movement checks off all the boxes, not just on fascism, but on a particularly virulent neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic variant of fascism, like the worst, classic Third Reich type of fascism. It is conspiratorialist, it is anti-Semitic, it is cultist, it is irrational and anti-intellectual, it embraces political violence. And yes, as Tony was saying, it's eliminationist. I mean, they literally talk about Trump coming back independent of an election, maybe even, depending on what Q says, next week, and overthrowing and executing and torturing leading top Democrats and sending some of them to Guantanamo. It's extraordinary. One interesting question for me is why this full embrace now? What's going on? I agree with Tony that if you're paying careful attention, you could see this guy was a QAnoner back through his presidency, but this is a new qualitative breakthrough, wearing the lapel, his photo, and the one-fingered salute thing that's going on at these rallies. Did he do it again in North Carolina last night? I don't know. The one I knew about was Youngstown, Ohio. Yeah.
Although I think that there was some footage about a Trump security guard trying to prevent it from happening. I don't know whether that was
so why now,
this one or the last one.
I think he's trying to up the ante of fear that he wants to impose on those who are investigating and may charge him, and there are multiple legal inquiries and investigations underway now. And, talk about fascism, him and Lindsey Graham, the two-faced reptile South Carolina senator, both threatened political violence if the Department of Justice even dares to indict him. So I think there's a desire to up the ante of terrorism and terrorization against those who might investigate him. Maybe there's something going on mentally where his malignant narcissism, when he's a classic malignant narcissist, is being heightened as he feels cornered, trying to link himself more to this cult. That it ought to be one hell of a wake-up call that somebody embracing this shit is the kingmaker within one of the two major parties in the world's most powerful nuclear state. And he's the presidential front runner at the top of one of the two major capitalist parties. And he's saying this kind of crap. There's got to be a wake-up call about what's going on in this country and where we are and how low our political culture has really sunk. One of the dangers here is that he will mainstream QAnon in a way that he mainstreamed the Proud Boys. There's a new book out now. I can't remember the author, but he's been making the rounds on cable news. And he says Proud Boys were always there. But that moment in the 2020 presidential debates when Trump said, Proud Boys, stand back and stand by, just catapulted them in a new kind of way. It's a green light to this lunacy. So it's very dangerous.
I completely agree. There was this one line in Tony's Counterpunch article that really stood out. I thought it captured a lot. Tony wrote, quote, "The QAnon connection, perhaps more than anything else, demonstrates Trump's commitment to a fascist politics," end quote. And you both spoke in various ways to what those fascist politics are. And I think that there's a little bit from certain spheres of like, why is this news? He's always been this way. Nothing's different. And I think that kind of covers over how overt it's getting. And Paul, your point about like, this is intentional to normalize it on a whole other level where this just becomes part of political discourse where we talk about our political opponents being pedophiles. And that's just what we do now. And I think that is particularly ominous, especially when there's real world violence that is happening because of people that consume and peddle these dangerous conspiracies. I was wondering whether you had any other thoughts, either of you, on, the people who are just like laughing it off because it's ridiculous. And it is ridiculous, right? It is ridiculous to think that there's like reptile people. The conspiracies are absolutely ridiculous, but they're also dangerous.
As a historian, Hitler's blood libel and his wild conspiracy theories were very commonly laughed off and not taken seriously, both within Germany and across the supposedly responsible Western nations in the 1920s and the early 1930s. Give you one example. There's a minimization of the Trump threat, in general. I asked some people on Facebook recently how many folks are actually MAGA. And the numbers came in very low. People think it's a lot less than it really is. And then Tony sent me some data. I saw you asked that question. It's about 43% of the population approves Trump right now, the job he's doing. Trump being almost completely identified with MAGA. I think that'd be fair to say.
I would add, I think it depends on who you talk to, right? This is dark comedy for those of us who have been paying attention and know what's going on. There's a massive segment of the rest of the population that's just in complete denial. I was just talking to a relative today about this podcast, and they were rolling their eyes saying, oh, God, anybody who talks about their political opponents and mentions fascism or Hitler, that's just irresponsible. And my response is, well, so what happens when it's appropriate? What happens when you actually have documentation and evidence? Well, people don't see it because they don't want to see it. These are people who support Donald Trump, so they have an obvious reason to reframe this. I just saw some segments with Sean Hannity recently where he's obsessed with this term Walmart shoppers. He's a Walmart shopper and all the other Trumpers are Walmart shoppers. They're not fascists, he said. He wants to be very clear about that. They're not fascists. I mean, this is part of a larger political culture. We're talking about the news media. I talk about it in my book in detail, where you can use the word populism to refer to Donald Trump and Trumpism. You can use maybe sometimes the word authoritarian. Fascism, no, that's really been sort of cut out of the discussion. And that's not just in general. When you talk about Trump and the term fascism, like you could be talking about QAnon, which is clearly neo-Nazi in its politics. The term fascism almost never comes up from the research that I've been doing. And this is not just like Fox News or something. You could be talking about like the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC. Kyle Rittenhouse poses with these Proud Boy fascists, and they're all doing hand signals for white supremacy. And he's not a white supremacist or a fascist. The coverage very rarely ever suggested that, if ever.
He's a Walmart shopper.
Yeah, he's a Walmart shopper. Peyton Gedron, the Buffalo shooter, as a self-identified fascist, almost never called a fascist in any of the news stories. Robert Crimo, the guy who was responsible for the Highland Park shooting, not a single story in any of these allegedly liberal media talking about him as a fascist, even though he's a self-identified alt-righter. Wears alt-right stuff, content, shirts, Pepe the Frog. This is neo-fascist stuff, right? He was targeting a synagogue, scoping it out. So, yeah, I mean, people just don't deal with it. Like, that's the way that it's been, is that the evidence is so damning across so many different points. You just don't talk about any of it. If you talk about it, then you let the cat out of the bag. So that's really where we're at for a lot of Americans. And apparently you're at that point with 43% of them, right? Because they're still normalizing Donald Trump. And that's not even getting into people who don't support him but won't use the language of fascism.
Yeah, I think that there is an insistence to, even after all that we've experienced, to not name it. And when people do name it, that is the story, people naming it. Instead of the story being, they use the F word, instead of the story being, as Paul put it, one of two major parties in this country is completely consolidated around this. What a crisis that is. But instead, the story is so-and-so called XYZ a fascist. And oftentimes they're not even calling the person a fascist. It's calling a particular policy move or decision semi-fascist or having a hint of fascism or something like that.
There is a significant, I'm noticing an uptick in the use of the word fascism since Biden said semi-fascism. It's now regularly said on Joy Reid. It's regularly said on Chris Hayes, but they say it in passing. They don't linger on it. It's just like another bad thing about that other terrible party. Oh, those racist, ecocidal, pandemicists, sexist. Oh, and by the way, fascist. Those crazy fascist Republicans, right? Oh, those crazy MAGA Republicans, I love that. They don't stop and linger, and they don't take the word seriously and dig into what exactly that means, what its characteristics are, which means they end up in a way normalizing it. It's just astonishing how weak the treatment of it is, even when it is used.
It's a good point. I wanted to turn to the vicious xenophobia and white supremacy embodied in the fascist kidnappings by Trump protege, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, where migrants and asylum seekers were flown from Texas to Massachusetts. And I was hoping, Paul, you could speak to a bit on what that was about and this trend that has been characterized by the press as a political stunt. One thing I feel like I have to point out is that the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has nothing to say about this, to the point where even Democratic Congress people are even like, what the hell? I know that this is something you wrote recently about.
The phrase political stunt is another example of downplaying and almost normalizing and making it just, like another crazy thing that's part of the partisan politics of those crazy Republicans. And there's two things wrong with that. A, there are crimes involved. And second of all, it's fascism. So let's get to both of those. Let me just mention what I think the crimes that are relevant. I did look at the federal kidnapping statute. They were deceptively lured and carried away for perceived political reward. Kidnapping does not have to involve an economic ransom or an economic reward. It can be, and there's a big emphasis in the federal statutory law on deception and false promises and luring people away. That seems to be one of probably the best angles. They violated state budgetary laws and state budgetary rules within Florida. DeSantis did. That money that he used is not designated for going to Texas to get people who are allegedly coming to Florida and then flying them to Massachusetts. It's complete violation of any normal state's budgetary rules. And there may be issues involved with the transport of people of unclear legal status across state lines. That may violate some federal laws. Fascism, it's profoundly illegal, and they're doing illegal things in the name of law and order, which is a classic fascist calling card. There's the obvious racialism of what they did, the racist nativism of it, which is a big theme. Border racism, border obsession, border paranoia is a consistent theme in fascist thought. The racialism is so intense here that DeSantis seems to have screwed up and not completely appreciated the fact that the people he illegally transported were Venezuelans, right? So from one perspective, he's supposed to want to treat those folks somewhat decently because they are fleeing supposedly, this is in the media, they say again, socialist communist tyranny in Venezuela. He should be treating them with kid gloves. He's got some trouble now with his right-wing Venezuelan voters in Miami and elsewhere. But the racialism of it all just trumped all that. He didn't care. He just brown-skinned people. Then there's the cruelty. This is another calling card. Fascism doesn't have a monopoly on cruelty. Don't get me wrong. There's an intense, explicit, open cruelty in fascism, deceiving people, taking them off where they don't know they're going, and then dumping them like human garbage in places where they're confused and scared. You've screwed up their immigration hearings. They're trying to declare asylum. Now they don't know where they are, what's going to happen. And then there's this attempted humiliation of your liberal enemies, this proud that will show those liberals up in Martha's Vineyard and will dump this human garbage on them, and they'll be ashamed. They actually didn't get humiliated. They had a fairly decent response, like what human beings would do to try and take care of other human beings. It's not just DeSantis, by the way. Greg Abbott in Texas has been sending busloads of these people, the same thing with false promises, and then dumping them in Chicago. And apparently him and Ducey in Arizona have been dumping busloads of people. They do it in New York, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. There's fascism connected with DeSantis, should surprise nobody that's studied his gubernatorial reign. This is a guy, he has championed the Don't Say Gay bill. He has led the charge against so-called critical race theories, alleged grooming of kindergartners. He has introduced a Crimes of Communism Day in Florida. I mean, can you fathom that? There's a reflection of his Venezuelan and especially his Cuban voting base there. He's put together used state money for like a private state militia to follow him around. He almost never appears in public without a bunch of armed law enforcement type of people around him. He cultivates a Mussolini-esque persona. He's sort of the fascist waiting in the wings, kind of chomping at the bit in case Trump goes down or in case Trump really doesn't want to run again, which is a possibility. And then he's hoping to just move in to that MAGA space. Whether he can do that or not is an interesting question. He doesn't have some assets that Trump has.
Did you want to add anything, Tony?
This is still an ongoing story, of course, with the migrants too, right? We know that this Texas county sheriff is doing a criminal investigation of this too. These are people who are here illegally as migrants and lured under false pretenses based on promises from alleged Good Samaritans who did not end up being Good Samaritans in the case of DeSantis. This is a political sort of operation. They were promised employment and housing and education and other types of benefits, and then were just dumped. So this is really not just potentially illegal and criminal, but also a great example of what Paul's talking about regarding dehumanization. And these are important aspects of fascist eliminationist ideology, right? The idea that people can be treated like a means to an end, dehumanized, dumped, and just disregarded as trash.
Another aspect of this that I believe I talked briefly about on the last episode was the way that this shows the federal government and the law itself, how seemingly endlessly amenable they can be to the threat of fascist violence, which this is. This is a form of violence to kidnap people, to dump people where they know no one, and are further at the whim of various forces. It just goes to show that there isn't some magical force in our legal system that keeps this all in check, where the fascists can't go too far out of bounds because then the law will step in. And I think that that's how a lot of good people, unfortunately, feel in relation to this. And that links back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the media coverage of fascism, or the lack of coverage of whether this is fascism, or the passing coverage of fascism, as Paul talked about.
Maybe not all that noticed aspect of this is the kind of neo-Confederate collaboration that certainly took place between DeSantis and Abbott. I can't imagine that DeSantis didn't tell Abbott that he was going to fly a plane in there and pick up Venezuelans. And you've got Republican governors who are purporting to make national immigration policy right now. I remember, like, at some point last year, maybe it was further back than that, when I was in Iowa, and hearing that the right-wing neo-fascist governor of that state, Kim Reynolds, had sent a bunch of state troopers down to Texas to participate in border patrol. I mean, there is this kind of neo-Confederate nationalism that they have amongst themselves that they're trying to cultivate. So, maybe that's part of our drift towards civil war.
I think that's a really important point, Paul. And I think you also see that within some of the discussion that's been happening regarding abortion and the traveling between states and things like that, and the coordinated surveillance and things like that. In terms of the media and normalization, I've been thinking about how, yes, even during quote unquote normal times, the mainstream media has played a role in mollifying people, in saying, no, the danger is not that big of a deal when it comes to fascism coming to power in the United States. I feel like this is escalating, that the mainstream media, that is, are continuing to cover the most incendiary, the most outrageous, the most criminal actions, the most overt fascism as merely part of the horse race, and simultaneously failing to cover stories that could potentially break that noise, or covering stories in the way that could break the noise. And I was wondering, Tony, if you think that's a fair assessment, and because you do so much work with quantitative studies, is there a way that we can measure the impact of the way that the media talks about or doesn't talk about the threat of fascism?
Well, you're talking about more broadly a both sidesism problem, where there's sort of a gentleman's agreement among journalists and political leaders, where the political class and journalists won't throw around this kind of language. So how do you sort of study the effects of that? Well, I've only really gotten to the point, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, where you can sort of look at the content, right? And you can see that the message is just not getting through systematically in terms of the use of the word fascism or fascist. And so I haven't seen any polls, because it doesn't seem that pollsters are terribly interested in this. I'd have to sort of commission my own poll to do this. But whether people who pay a lot of attention to the news are more likely to be concerned with the problem of rising fascism. It's just not something that's ever really been polled with regards to media impact. My expectation that you would not see any real significant impact of people paying more attention to the news and being more concerned with either Trump being fascist or with fascism in general, because it's just not salient at all. I mean, this is something that the media, it's just very clear from the news coverage. It hasn't been a real focus. There's a reason for that. The reason for it is because they typically take a page from the political system itself. And so when you have a Democratic Party that's very, at most, hemming and hawing, Biden will occasionally use a term like semi-fascism. He'll call Trump sort of like Goebbels, right, in regard to the big lie of election propaganda and the allegedly stolen election, right? Obama and Hillary Clinton have private phone conversations when Trump originally won about how they've got to stop a fascist. That was the motivation in 2016. This is what's going on. You have a political system that hasn't taken it seriously. I don't think that Biden is stupid. I don't think that Obama and Hillary are stupid. I think that they know what it is. I think that they're afraid of fully recognizing, maybe to themselves as well as to the public, the severity of the threat. It's this idea that Paul tossed out here of the way in which an MSNBC will casually talk about fascism. There's no casual discussions of fascism. It's either a threat and then it's an existential threat, or it isn't. You don't have a situation, unless you're inviting disaster, where you have someone like Joe Biden who, well, he hasn't talked to Merrick Garland about bringing charges against this fascist, whether it's related to trying to extort votes in Georgia and throw the 2020 election, or the national security documents that were stolen, right? Or participating in an insurrection and violence, in stoking that, right? And being a part of it. These things are all illegal. And so you have multiple avenues here where you could take action, and it just hasn't happened. The Democratic Party has this fear that what kind of precedent would it set if we did this? And then this becomes a partisan game of prosecuting presidents. So there's been this gentleman's agreement forever that you don't prosecute a sitting president or a former president. Well, the real problem here is that if you don't do that, the alternative of inaction is even more dangerous, because then you allow people to do things like engage in an insurrection and try and steal an election. And next time, maybe it doesn't end so well for you when you have a president who's embracing QAnon. And this is a movement that wants to execute you as a political partisan. So I don't think that they're stupid. I think they know what this is. I think that they're deluded about the severity of the threats. And so the journalists are just sort of taking a page from these political leaders, and they're downplaying it. I think everybody knows on some level what's going on here. They're just sort of in denial about the extent of the threat of fascism.
You know, that gentleman's agreement, I think, goes back and has a lot to do with the U.S. president's role as the commander-in-chief of a vast global empire. And if you're the president, you're going to have to commit war crimes. It just goes with that job. You're going to blow some people up. You're going to overthrow some governments. You're going to bomb some regions of Africa or the Middle East, or name your region. No one's going to want the job. Hence, Obama's let's look forward instead of backward in regard to the epic, monumental crimes of George W. Bush involved in with torture and, above all, the invasion and occupation of Iraq. What's new and different here is the crime committed. Coups in Venezuela, coups in Honduras, coups in Guatemala, and the Congo are fine. Now we have a guy who tried to do a coup in the imperial freaking homeland. And they're still doing it, trying to overthrow previously normative bourgeois democracy and constitutional rule of law within the U.S. itself. And that's just an unprecedented situation. I think they never thought they'd come up against something like that. And people don't want to deal with it. I remember watching the 2020 election night on PBS. They were just naming off the different election returns in the different states as if it was just a normal, usual presidential election. And I thought to myself, do you not understand the mail-in ballots still have to be counted? Do you not understand that this lunatic is going to declare himself the victor before the mail-in ballots? And then do you not understand that after the mail-in ballots come in and probably show that Trump lost, he's going to deny them and going to insist that he won and going to engage in a long struggle to overthrow the election? It was just this happy face as if it was a normal election. And, you know, I'm thinking about 2024 right now. Is that how we're going to cover that presidential election, when we may very well have in place high-level, state-level Republican election officials, governors, secretaries of state, and attorney generals who are actively committed to election nullification and nullifying the popular votes in their states. I mean, this is extraordinary. This right-wing fascist Supreme Court, the same one that gave us Dobbs v. Jackson, that gave us a rollback of Miranda rights, that gave us an assault on the EPA's ability to regulate carbon emissions, that gave us a few other horrible decisions this last session. It's a horrible court, an absolutely ridiculous court. Is this next term going to hear a case in which I'm guessing they're likely to give a thumbs up to the independent state legislature theory, whereby states may be permitted to veto, step above state courts in terms of exercising complete authority over what electoral college slates get sent to Congress for certification the next presidential election. It's a hell of a thing. It's extraordinary what they're doing. It's just bizarre, this acting as if everything's normal.
There's definitely psychological aspects of it, and even though they are definitely not what is primary or principal. You know, as you were talking about this nothing to see here kind of culture isn't just spontaneous either. It's what people are told, whether they're told it through the media that they consume and the lack of any sense of that something rotten is afoot coverage, or just in campuses and universities or wherever you're looking, this kind of largely and very quickly people acclimate because people are told to. What we were outraged by yesterday is now just today's compromised position and tomorrow's limit on what's possible. This is something that I look to your work, Paul, for frequent reminders to not do in terms of the role you play in keeping people honest on how we got here, how we continue to get here, how indeed the Democratic Party has enabled this monstrosity, or perhaps put better grease to the wheel, even while you are very clear to delineate the differences that do exist in that you don't call the Democrats fascist, even while you can condemn actions of them. And one of your most recent pieces was an in-depth piece on how indeed the assault on abortion rights was a bipartisan affair. And I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about why you think it's so key for people to come to grips with this.
Well, you know, you see the Democrats now rushing to use the Dobbs v. Jackson decision as what they think will be the basis for winning the midterms in 2022. And it's not shaping up that they're going to win the midterms, incidentally. And that comes across as almost like an ex post facto response to the decision. In fact, I remember talking to Democrats leading up to the decision, and they were actually looking forward to it. They're actually saying, oh, yeah, the imposition of patriarchal female enslavement of forced motherhood, that sucks, but we're going to take advantage of that, as if the partisan electoral process in this country is just nothing but a policy referendum. But, you know, the Democrats are a bourgeois Democratic Party. They continue to maintain a kind of ever weakening hold on electoral so-called democracy and rule of law. And yet they're at the same time and simultaneously deeply complicit with the fascization of American politics. Their clear capture by concentrated wealth, by elite corporate and financial interests. Their commitment to capitalism tends to discredit democracy because there's a problem in capitalism and there's an inherent tendency towards the concentration of wealth. Well, the concentration of wealth is also the concentration of power, which means that policies, even when they're in charge, generally don't reflect majority sentiments. And at the same time, capitalism is constantly creating new and different types of chaos and crises: ecological crisis, bacteriological crisis, immune diseases, savage economic inequalities, problems that demand solutions. And people want solutions. And when they want solutions and democracy is discredited and is shown not to work, they become open to the notion, I alone can fix it. They become open to the notion of authoritarian solutions. There's this long-standing corporate captive neoliberal abandonment and shutting down of their own base. Leaves the barn door open for the GOP to win. And even at the same time as the GOP has been transforming itself, you saw it under Obama. You could even see aspects of it under Clinton in the 90s and certainly under Bush, even as that party is becoming fascist. And in the American variant party, they continue to preach, let's reach out across the aisle, as if this is just another normal party. Reach out across the aisle to a party that is eliminationist towards them and towards democracy and towards liberalism, just consistently refusing and to ever call that party what it really is. They embrace a lot of the same narratives that are part of fascist ideology. Liberal Hollywood embraces violence. The Democrats have long embraced Pentagon military violence. Liberal Democratic mayors in cities embrace mass incarceration. Democrats embrace the neoliberal schooling processes that are part of the dumbing down of the population, which is part of fascization. And they embrace American exceptionalism. The Democrats are real big on American exceptionalism. Listen to Obama, listen to Bill Clinton, listen to Joe Biden. It's always, we're the greatest country that ever lived, the beacon to the world. And, that kind of creates a sense of, well, it can't happen here because how could that ever happen here if we're such a great country? And now the Democrats literally are providing literal, material, financial support to the worst MAGA Republicans in numerous congressional races. For all I know, they're doing it in some state races, too. They did that during the primaries with the Pied Piper strategy, as it was called, that Hillary Clinton carried out in 2016. What they'll tell you is the real intense QAnon MAGA Republicans are the most beatable ones. Talk about a low bar and making it clear that you don't have a positive program to run on, that your hope for the midterms is to coast off of this horrible abortion decision that you anticipated favorably before. And then your other hope is that the Trumpies will be so appalling that that'll help you win in 2022.
The last thing that you were saying, Paul, I think there's we have no program, but there's also the ignoring that there's any chance in hell that there are millions of people who actually go along with this fascist program, that this is a country that is filled with fascists. This is a country that is time after time in many of these primaries, the most delusional have won. That the refusal to think that deranged MAGA has a chance to consistently underestimate your opponent, and not just underestimate them, but to discount the fact that they don't care an iota about your process of free and fair elections is just insane.
From the polling data that I've collected myself, you're just talking about straight up fascist, alt-right style people who identify with that. It's probably around 25 million people. Tens of millions of people are willing to normalize that stuff. And that's not even getting into the 43% of adults who still have a favorable view of Trump. So I wouldn't call them out and out fascists, but I'd say they're in the orbit of it if Donald Trump is at this point. So, what is 43% of adults? You've got about 250 million adults in this country. 43% is about 110 million people. So if you're going to hang your hat on that, they're not going to vote for Donald Trump. You have, tens of millions of people here, tens of millions who will religiously stick to this notion that no matter how bad a Republican might get, the Democrats are always going to be worse. And they will find a way to justify it. That's a very dangerous sort of game to play. And so that's just also a sign that the Democratic Party is not very serious in putting forward any sort of real opposition here. The story of the Democratic Party over the last few decades is demobilizing working class, poor people, people of color. It's not so much that these people overwhelmingly flocked to the Republican Party. They just didn't vote in large numbers, particularly in depressed areas of this country that have lost a lot of jobs. And what you have with the Republican Party is people who are willing to, normalize the most atrocious of things because they think that the Democratic Party is worse. They've been socialized to believe that. These are not people who are particularly poor, generally speaking. They tend to be overwhelmingly white, middle-aged to older, middle to middle upper income, if you're talking about the mass base of the GOP, right? And so they're privileged people who aren't going to be targeted by Trump's fascist politics, and they'll find a way to ignore those things. They will, and they always have. I don't think it's going to end well for the Democratic Party, and we are headed for disaster because of it.
That said, my interests are not in where does this go for the Democratic Party. I don't care about their future. I care about the future of humanity. The future is going to be in a really rotten place, a horrific place, if people continue to delude themselves that there's no chance of these fascists tasting, let alone holding power again. So that's just my thought. As the fascist threat escalates and the drumbeat to the midterms gets louder, there is a mountain of delusions being fed to and happily consumed by, in my opinion, too many decent people. And I'm sure you both have heard them all. There's all the variations of we got to vote to stop fascism. This takes various forms. Stop worrying, stop talking about fascism. We got to wait till 2024, or the flavor of everything is on the line in these midterms. Vote in the midterms, or this will be the last free and fair election. Vote in the midterms, or they won't accept the will of the voters next time, even while more and more Republicans are not accepting the will of the voters now. So I'm not sure about that one. And then what, Paul, you had talked about, thanks to Roe being overturned, we're going blue, baby, everywhere. Look at what Kansas showed us. And then the last, but not to be discounted, Trump won't be back in office. He'll be in jail. If there's thoughts that either of you have on how to counter any of these, I am all ears. And I know our listeners are too.
I'll say something about the Trump in jail thing. I did a piece on Substack recently that was 7 reasons that he's not going to jail. It's a very fluid situation. There's something going on in the ruling class. Like I said, this is an unprecedented type of, is the gentleman's agreement about you don't prosecute former presidents going to hold in this particular case. This is a new kind of case. The guy actually tried to overthrow previously normative bourgeois democracy in America and is threatening to do so again. But, it just seems like a stretch. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope it changes. They're very afraid of political backlash. They're very afraid of violent backlash, and they're very afraid of setting a precedent. You hear this again and again. The United States is not a banana republic that throws its former presidents in jail, right? We don't do like Brazil, or we don't do like, name your other third world country, blah, blah, blah. Well, you know what? Maybe you need to be like one of those countries for a change, at least in this particular case, because this is fascism. And if you don't stop it, it's going to dig in, and it's going to be here for a very long goddamn time. But the notion that they're going to put him in jail just seems dubious to me. I don't see them doing that. Wait till 24 and all hell breaks loose. All hell may break loose in 24. It is not looking good. There are a lot of problems afoot. And that includes what kind of mechanisms might be in place in battleground states when 24 comes. And by the way, that includes what the balance in the House of Representatives may be come the 2024 election, because there's a lot of ways that they can use, if the GOP holds the House, that they can use that position to screw with the 2024 presidential election. You might want to get started on that right now. I don't particularly have a problem with people voting. I never say don't vote, never. But I always say it's very time staggered. It takes about 10 minutes. You do it once every 2 or every 4 years. I mean, one of the problems with putting all your eggs in the electoral basket and in voting in the United States and voting for Democrats and electoral politics is they're pretty damn weak right now. It's a pretty damn weak counter to fascism. We already discussed the Democrats. They're pretty much the party of Citigroup and Goldman Sachs and the Pentagon and Boeing and so forth. But beyond the Democrats, bad as they are and as right-wing as they tend to be, the system is stacked against them. We have a very unusual form of bourgeois democracy, which dates from 18th century slave owners, for whom democracy was the ultimate nightmare. And you start putting together the Electoral College, which is preposterous. Try to explain the Electoral College to not only someone from another country, but probably to most Americans. They don't understand it. The absurd Senate apportionment regime, whereby Wyoming and California both have 2 senators, even though Wyoming has less than 600,000 people and California has 40 million people. The extreme power of the lifetime appointed Supreme Court and the power of judicial review, and an underestimated factor, states' rights, which is a really distinctive aspect of the American political system. 50 different jurisdictions, and they have remarkable power to make policy in defiance of overall national majority opinion. And then you have all the constitutionally Supreme Court enabled under the Citizens United decision, dark right-wing money from revanchist billionaires that can tilt the system. And it's just a hell of a thing to try and tell people that this is going to save you from the fascization of the country. So we're obviously going to need more than voting. We're going to need movements. We're going to need people power. We're going to need people in the streets. I think a House controlled by the GOP in the next 2 years would be just utter chaos.
I think that if things stay on the trajectory that they're on, absolutely. I try not to operate in a world of fantasy, but I do have a recognition that even as totally fucked as we are, I think that there still is a majority in this country that does not want the full nightmare that a fully consolidated fascism would bring in this country. And I think that there are millions of people that at various levels of recognition are already alarmed and do not like the direction that things are headed in. And I think that all of us, the people listening, very much included, have a responsibility to continue sounding the alarm, to continue talking about things that make people uncomfortable, to continue to speak the unpopular, uncomfortable, but irrefutable truth that is the danger that we face and what that would mean. And I think that not just speaking the truth, but also getting organized, as Paul was talking about. And I think that there is a movement that we are lucky to have, an organized network that isn't waiting until it's too late to act. And that is Refuse Fascism. So listeners, I know that what we talk about every week, especially this week, is scary, and rightfully so. And we are not hopeless. We are not powerless, but it does mean that we have to roll up our sleeves and we have work to do. And that work can't be confined to a few minutes of voting in November. So that was a long-winded way of saying, don't feel like shit, do something about it. And that something can be as small as signing up at refusefascism.org. It can also look like writing to Tony and Paul and spreading what they're writing. And so I'll say more about that in a bit. I wanted to give both of you, if you had any closing thoughts, any final myths you want to bust in terms of how we can refuse fascism, or anything that we didn't talk about that you want to address.
Well, let me give a shout out to Tony's point that he just made about the importance of prosecuting Trump. It's not clear that the GOP, which is now a fascist party, has a replacement. I'm not sure that DeSantis or Abbott or God knows who has that kind of background in whatever that weird charisma this orange lunatic has with his base. We're going to find out perhaps whether that can be replicated. It's very important that this guy be put away, at the very least disqualified from running again. I've been wondering for a while, where's the mass movement to demand the prosecution of this guy? When are crowds going to show up outside the Department of Justice and demand that Garland move on this? I guess the main myths that I just want to reinforce that we really need to gut check and question people on are this American exceptionalist notion that it can't happen here. The myth that I know personally a lot of people engage in, that you can ignore politics, that you can just sort of not pay attention to them and sort of live in a privatized world where all that crazy stuff out there is just something I really don't need to pay attention to. When you're in the audience, when you're in the crowd, just watching the game, if that even, of course, a lot of people aren't even watching, right? The game has a way of jumping up off of the field and impacting your life in really, really horrible ways. And the abortion decision, which caught a lot of people more by surprise than they should have been caught, is a really classic case of that. And that's a case where the game has really jumped out and is starting to have a direct impact on young people's lives.
Well, I want to thank you. Thank you both. This has been a very meaningful conversation, and I honestly could chat with y'all all day, but I want to let you both rest up, recover, get well, and thank you for sharing your expertise, your perspective, and your time with us. And you can follow Paul on Twitter at StreetWriter17. A link to his site and to get his latest book are in the show notes. To read more from Tony, check out the show notes for a link to his book. And I am also going to link to his page on Counterpunch so you can read many of his other articles, including the QAnon one that we discussed earlier in this conversation. At the beginning of this interview, we spoke about Trump's full-on embrace of QAnon. For more on this topic, I encourage folks to go and listen to episode 68, our interview with Dr. Mia Bloom, co-author of Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon, that was uploaded July 18th, 2021. We encourage folks to get in the street and take action this Wednesday, September 28th, International Safe Abortion Day. What we need, what the times demand urgently, vitally, and most of all, is a movement of people who care about abortion rights, who care about justice, who want to refuse fascism in the streets with righteousness, with the determination to put things on the line to turn this whole trajectory around. Let's take a page from our sisters in Latin America, who against their conservative Catholic governments raised the green bandana in a green wave for abortion rights and went into the streets again and again, growing in numbers and determination. They tore down the laws criminalizing abortion in several countries and continue fighting in many more. So this Wednesday, September 28th, International Safe Abortion Day, let's make a leap in gathering this wave of struggle here. Raise the green bandana in public acts of protest, big and small. This is part of fueling massive society-wide, nonviolent, but relentless sustained protest and resistance that grows, drawing in more and more people, compelling those in power to respond to our demand. Legal abortion on demand and without apology everywhere. Learn more, find organizing tools, and register your actions for that day at riseup4abortionrights.org. Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, ideas for topics or guests, or lend a skill. Tweet me at Sam B. Goldman, drop me a line at samanthagoldman@refusefascism.org, or leave me a message by visiting anchor.fm/refuse-fascism and hit that message button. Want to support the show? It's simple. Show us some love by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice. And of course, follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Share, comment on social media. When you share this, you are helping change the way people think that prevents them from taking necessary action. You're helping people look at uncomfortable truths and act with daring. Together, we're forging understanding and relationships aimed at preventing the consolidation of fascism. Chip in to support our pod and content creation to help people understand and act to stop the fascist threat. We have no sponsors, and we count on you. Donate by visiting refusefascism.org and hitting that donate button. Thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkleman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers. We have transcripts available for each episode, so be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox each week. If you're interested in helping with our transcripts, like copy editing and all that jazz, please reach out. We'll be back next Sunday. Until then, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.